I'm the new kid on the block at EEOC, and actually I'm a new Fed. I've been a Fed for less than 3 years, but I've been involved in disability rights for a lot more years than that, and for that reason I've been asked to share with you some of my thoughts about what discrimination against people with disabilities is, about the disability rights movement, and about the comparison that we might make between disability rights and disability rights movement and discrimination against people with disabilities with other kinds of discrimination that most of you in this room are more familiar with. Three things I want to emphasize to you right off the bat are, number one, there is a disability rights movement. Okay? You may not have seen it. It's not the same magnitude as the other civil rights movements that you have been more familiar with. But we've been there, and I think you've seen the result in the Americans with Disabilities Act this year. Secondly, and this may sound a little strange for those of you in this room, I'm kind of preaching to the choir, there is discrimination against people with disabilities, and that's the reason there's a disability rights movement. Most of you probably have not thought about discrimination against people with disabilities as much as you've thought about other kinds of discrimination, simply because it hasn't been part of your jobs. It hasn't been part of the public view as much as other kinds of discrimination, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that kind of discrimination in a minute. And thirdly, I think that we can see, if we think about it, that the kinds of discrimination that people with disabilities face is not really that different than the kinds of discrimination that other groups who are represented by more than, clearly, I'd say, what, more than three-quarters of the folks in this room face as well. You've been told, I'm sure, at least some of you have been told, some of you heard, that the Americans with Disabilities Act is different than other kinds of statutes which talk about, which define discrimination. And there is a difference in terms of remedies. Remedies, as you probably have heard, are individual. But I don't think that affects very much the idea of discrimination, the kinds of discrimination that occur, or the result of discrimination. To me, discrimination is discrimination is discrimination. It occurs or it doesn't occur. If it does occur, then it's something that, in my head, is bad and we have to get rid of. Is there discrimination against people with disabilities? This is where I get my little dig in at some of my friends. One of the reasons I think it's important for us to talk about it is that even those folks who are advertised as most involved in and invested in ending discrimination against people with disabilities discriminate against people with disabilities. For example, at least two of the major civil rights groups who shall remain nameless, who have headquarters in Washington, D.C., who lobbied very heavily for the Americans with Disabilities Act, have offices which are inaccessible to me. I can't get in. It's very interesting that they're a little embarrassed about this. It's been brought to their attention a number of times by a number of people. It's very interesting that the response that they give sounds exactly like the responses from the National Federation of Independent Businesses, the various small business groups who are lobbying against the Americans with Disabilities Act. We are a small organization. We don't have much money. You wouldn't really expect us to waste money on making our headquarters accessible, would you, Phil? So even among our friends, when it comes right down to the crunch, we've got problems in terms of people's perceptions of how important ending discrimination against people with disabilities is. I sat down this morning while I was drinking my coffee, and I was thinking, you know, I should really give some examples of discrimination. And I wrote this little, well, all of you can't see this, but I just wrote down on a piece of paper a list that has maybe 15 lines on it. Each line represents a story that I know about discrimination against somebody or some group of people. How long do you think it took me to write it down? As fast as I could write. The length was determined by, when I got down here, I thought, this is ridiculous, you know. I've already got more stories I could possibly tell, so I stopped. It is not difficult for somebody who's been involved in disability rights to bring forward stories of discrimination against people with disabilities. Some of you know, one which has to do with this agency, some of you probably know that last week, yeah, the chairman was denied access to a TWA flight and therefore could not go to Kansas City to give a speech that he was scheduled to give. That's very common. That is, I mean, almost everybody who uses a wheelchair has a story about airplanes. I've got several stories about airplanes. Last year, I got on a United flight because I knew the name of a vice president of United Airlines. That is the only reason that I got on the plane, all right? If I hadn't been me, if I'd been most people with disabilities, I would not have got on that flight. But when I mentioned this guy's name and said, oh, Bob Sampson is a friend of mine, and gee, when I get to Chicago, I'm going to call him up and discuss this, they suddenly let me on the flight. That kind of thing happens all the time. I got a call yesterday, day before yesterday, Tuesday, from a friend of mine in Washington, D.C., who's been involved in disability rights for a number of years, who was irate because he'd gone to vote, right? They'd moved his polling place from an accessible location to an inaccessible location. And he had to wait something like an hour to get somebody to come downstairs with a ballot so he could vote. I could name voting stories from almost every state in this country. I got a call last week from Senator Harkin's office, because they know that I used to do a lot of work on voting, about a woman who was denied the opportunity to register to vote because they said, you know, you are a mentally retarded person. Mentally retarded people obviously can't vote. I know a woman in Mississippi that I talked to a couple months ago, same thing. There's stories that just go on and on and on about things like that. So there are several hundred children in the state of Georgia who get no public education at all, because they are children with disabilities. There's a woman in Northern Virginia who had to go into a nursing home recently who was, she had one of these little three-wheel vehicles I'm sure you've seen around that people drive around, was taken away from her because they told her it was dangerous for her to drive this thing, right? So they gave her a wheelchair that she couldn't push and then charged her $1 every time she wanted to go from her room down to the courtyard to sit in the sunshine. These things are not things that used to happen. They are things that still are happening today. A few years ago, Sharon Mistler, whom you will meet a little bit later this morning, and I were working at a Center for Independent Living in Tulsa, Oklahoma. There was a guy who came into our center whose name was George, who was a person with a disability, who had gone through the entire downtown section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, asking every store, every commercial location for a job. He could not get a job. He worked in a sheltered workshop where he made enough money to pay for the bus that took him to the sheltered workshop and his lunch, which he was charged for. He wanted to work so badly that he was willing to do that, to live under those conditions. That Center for Independent Living was across the courtyard from a public housing project where they'd stashed a whole lot of people with disabilities, more than 100. It took us about 3 months to discover what most of the people in that building, who were people with cerebral palsy, wanted from us, because they were too embarrassed to tell us. What they wanted was to learn how to read. These are all adult people of normal intelligence. They could not read because the state of Oklahoma, in its great wisdom, had sent them all to a special school, and of course, because they were people with disabilities, especially because they were people with cerebral palsy, there was no point in teaching them to read. So that was the service that we ended up performing for them. In Denver, 2 weeks ago, a man who is severely disabled, he uses an electric chair, who has been an activist involved in disability rights there for more than a decade, was burned to the point where he is now in the hospital in a coma and is expected to die. We still don't know who did it. One of his friends suspects that it was probably teenagers who thought that this was, you know, something that they didn't like having this guy in the neighborhood, and they get rid of him. They may not have realized how serious what they were doing was, but it's the sort of thing that still happens today. This is not something from the past. To me, the most horrific story, and this is horrific in a different way, that I've ever heard is from a woman who is a friend of mine who is a lawyer in California, who was talking to a group of children, disabled children, at a school. And she did what I would do, probably any of you would do. She asked them what they wanted to be when they grew up. Now, when you go do that to a classroom of normal, average kids, what are you going to get? I want to be a policeman. I want to be a fireman. I want to be a baseball player. I want to be a musician. I want to be a whatever, right? Not one child in this class could answer the question, because none of them had the perception that they would have productive adult roles in our society. And to me, that's really scary, that we are living in a society where we still perpetuate that kind of perception on the part of kids with disabilities. Here's two, I'm going to tell you two more little things. These are a little bit better. I like them. One was this year in Denver, when a guy who uses a wheelchair was kicked out of a restaurant because he uses a wheelchair. The restaurant made a mistake. This guy happened to be a member of ADAPT. ADAPT is the organization that some of you may have heard of, who have been going around the country stopping buses and getting arrested and thrown in jail and so forth, protesting against inaccessible public transportation. So he went back with 3 of his friends later in the same week, with a lawyer and with television cameras. And they went in the restaurant, and same thing, the owner threw them out. Said, we don't want you in here. You know, we do not want you to eat in this restaurant. One of the people who used the chair was also black. They were obviously sort of playing with this guy, the restaurant owner. He said, you can't deny me access to this restaurant. I'm black. And the guy said, I'm not denying you access because you are black. If you were just black, you could eat here. I'm denying you access because you use a wheelchair. And because you use a wheelchair, you can't eat here. The best one that I've heard recently has to do with a guy that I've known for about 3 or 4 years. When I first met him, he was living in a van in Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia. And he was living in a van because he had no money and he had no resources to public services and so forth. We connected him up with the Center for Independent Living, which Sharon Missler runs in Northern Virginia, the one you're going to meet in a little while. And over a period of time, they got him access to services. And finally, about sometime in the last couple of months, they helped him get a job. So he's been calling the center frequently during the last couple of months. First time he called, he said, I got a job. Second time he called, he said, guess what? I've got an office. He calls back the next day, I've got a typewriter. I got my own typewriter. And I got my own telephone. So we made sure that he got a ticket to the ADA signing. So he called up the day before the signing. He called Sharon. He said, Sharon, I'm ready to die and go to heaven. I've got a job, I've got an office, I got a telephone, I got a typewriter. For the first time in my life this month, I paid my own grocery bills, my own rent, all my other bills with money that I earned, and now I'm going to go to the White House tomorrow and I'm going to watch the President of the United States sign a bill that'll give me my rights. That's the sort of thing which still goes on in our society today. One of the problems that I think we face, everybody in this room is going to face, is that the root of a lot of discrimination against people with disabilities is on one end of what I kind of think of as a sliding scale of reasons why people are discriminated against. And it's what I think of in my own hand as kind of the benign end. That is, people don't think that they're doing bad things. The basis of most discrimination is attitudes. When we're dealing with disability, most of the people who are involved in discriminatory acts also have in their heads the perception, which we all grew up with, which I grew up with, which I still have too, that we as good Americans take care of people who can't take care of themselves. It's a kind of, it's a nice attitude to have. People with disabilities are perceived as people who cannot take care of themselves. Ergo, they can't work, right? Ergo, a lot of other things. The result is a lot of discrimination comes from what people think are good motives. When I think of my little sliding scale of attitudes, at one end it's hatred. It's just absolute rejection. At the other end it's these kinds of nice, protective, caretaking attitudes. I would suspect that discrimination attitudinally against people with disabilities is closer to discrimination against women than it is to anything else. I mean, you think back about, well, you can think about today, but you can think about 20 years ago when this was a real big topic, right? I can remember I actually had friends saying things like, well, if they want to be equal, I'm not going to open the door for them anymore, that women are protected in our society, that they're weaker than men, that they're less emotionally stable than men, that they're not as tough as men, and that therefore they shouldn't be allowed to do certain things, but in return they get this protection. Well, there's a lot of that same kind of perception with disability discrimination. It's not exactly the same, but I think the overlap in that area is the greatest. Monday night I went to the grocery store. This really happened Monday night. It was perfect, right before our training. And there was a woman, about 35 years old, very nice lady, in line behind me at the checkout counter. I had this big, I don't like to go to the grocery store, so I do a lot of shopping. I wanted this big basket full of junk. She said, I've been watching you while you went through the store, and I just think you're amazing. She said, you are an inspiration. And this is something which, if you are a person with a disability who does the things that everybody else does normally, like go to the grocery store, you are likely to encounter on occasion. And then she said, and you don't even use one of those motorized chairs. So, thinking about Sharon Wilkin and the chairman and some other people, I hastened to tell her that I didn't use a motorized chair because I don't need one, and that the people who do use them do need them, and that that's the only difference. It has nothing to do with character or being heroic or anything like that. Went right by her, right by her. Didn't hear it, You are just amazing. And then she said, this is the other part of the attitudinal thing, which I thought was really interesting. Do you live around here? And I said, yeah, I live about a mile from here. I live in Vienna. She said, do they give you physical therapy? She was a nice lady, and she wasn't trying to be, obnoxious in any way. But it was her presumption that because I'm a person with a disability, society takes care of me. Okay? That is the presumption of a lot of people. We are going to encounter that in terms of what goes on when more people with disabilities start looking for jobs and start filing complaints saying they're being discriminated against. That underlying attitude is going to be a big problem, I think. On Tuesday, when we did this training, one of the people who was a trainee told a story which I thought was really crucial in terms of this attitudinal problem and our role in the future in terms of ADA. And this is, let me tell you, it's a problem that I face as a person with a disability in the same way that everybody in this room who's not disabled has a problem. And that is the presumption, which is easy to make, that a person with a particular disability, of course, can't do X or can't do Y. What she said was that she'd gone shopping the other day and she went to Nordstrom's to buy some shoes. and the salesman who came up to wait on her was deaf. And he could speak, but not speak too well. She said she was a little bit shocked, but it worked. You know, she got the shoes. So she kind of stayed and watched. And her perception was that the reaction of all other customers this guy waited on was the same. They were a little bit startled at first because this guy clearly was deaf. But it seemed to work. They got their shoes, got what they came for, no problem. What she said then was what's crucial. She said, if I had been a field investigator for EEOC, and I had not seen this happen, and a deaf person filed a complaint of discrimination because they didn't get a job as a shoe salesman, I would have thought to myself, that's ridiculous. Of course a deaf person can't be a shoe salesman. Okay? Me too. Me too. The fact that I use a wheelchair doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to perceive that a deaf person can be a salesperson. I would be subject to the same kinds of doubts. And I think that that's an issue that's going to come up in EEOC a lot. That is, because we don't know what people can do, and because of the way we've grown up, and all the things that we've seen, all the commercials we've seen on television, right? The public interest things, which usually portrayed people with disabilities as heroic if they are able to do things. Our presumption is that they can't. And we're going to have to really work hard to keep an open mind and think, okay, this guy says he can do this. Let's at least give him the benefit of the doubt and let him explain how he could do this. Or let's look and see if there are other people around who have done this sort of thing. I want to just talk a little bit about the history of the disability rights movement, because I think it's important just to have a little bit of perception here. It's not that long anyway. And before I do, I want to say one more thing about people with disabilities in general, which has to do with demographics. I am not your typical person with a disability, okay? Surprise, surprise. Most of the people in this room who belong to protected classes, which is most of you, are not typical of the protected class you belong to. You're people who made it, you know, you're people who've done very well. Same thing with people with disabilities. Most people with disabilities are poor in this country. They are poor because if they become disabled, they're going to become poor probably, because they will probably lose their jobs, and they will probably end up being supported with various kinds of federal, state, and local money, and it doesn't add up to a whole lot, believe me. If they're born disabled, they're unlikely to be able to succeed in employment to the same degree that anybody in this room could. What does that mean? It means something else. It means there's a correlation in this country also between race and disability. If you are black, you are more likely to be disabled, and that's because you're more likely to be poor. Poor people in general are at risk to become disabled at every stage of life, more than are middle-class people. And that starts with prenatal care, and it goes up through neighborhoods people live in, it goes through kinds of jobs that people can get if they're poor, and so forth. So the proportion, the percentage of people who are non-white who are disabled is much higher than the percentage of people who are white. Third thing, which is a different kind of demographics, but it fits into the politics, is that people with disabilities have been segmented by their disabilities, in large part because of the caretaking apparatus that we've developed in this country. We have services for private charities and public services for blind people, and we have a different set for deaf people, and we have a different set for people with cerebral palsy and so forth. Well, that's affected the way people with disabilities interact with each other. The one thing that has brought people with disabilities together, and the thing which has been most evident in the last 2 years, is civil rights. That's something everybody can agree on. People who are deaf need different kinds of accommodations than I do. People who are blind may be discriminated against in a slightly different way than I am. But we all can agree we all get discriminated against. And we all can agree that with certain kinds of accommodations we can do certainly productive things. Like, I'm not going to be somebody who does heavy manual labor, because I don't fit into that category. But I don't think I've ever met a person with a disability who can't do some kind of work, okay? Everybody can do something. The disability rights movement is really, as I said, much smaller and much newer than the civil rights movements that you are more familiar with. It has learned, it has borrowed a lot from the black civil rights movement and the women's civil rights movement. Really, I would say, some people would argue with me, but I would say we're talking about the 1970s and 1980s when we talk about any kind of really public, active disability rights advocacy. In 1973, as probably most of you know, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was passed, which contained in it, almost by accident, Section 504, which is a pure civil rights statute. When I say almost by accident, that's important. People with disabilities did not mount massive protests to get that act. It was really a gift from Hubert Humphrey and a couple other members of Congress who kind of looked at it and said, well, you know, this is ridiculous. We're doing civil rights protections for other kinds of people. Let's stick this in here. That's important to me as somebody who's been involved in disability rights, because I believe that one of the most important things which builds a movement is denial of opportunity. All right, we weren't denied an opportunity there. Where we were denied an opportunity was when the regulations were not published. And as some of you probably know, that resulted in May of 1976 in a protest on Joe Califano's front lawn, the takeover of a federal building in San Francisco. Actually, there were several, but that was the biggest one. They held it for a lot of days. The Black Panthers brought food into them. I don't know how the Black Panthers got through the police lines, but they did. And for the first time, a lot of people with disabilities were perceived as people with power. It was really important. If you talk to anybody who was involved in those protests, it's still one of the most important events in their lives. The fact that people with disabilities could actually take over a building and stop, in this case, the federal government from doing business was extremely important. And that is one of the first, it is the first major time that happened. In the first year of the Reagan administration, when there was an effort to weaken the Section 504 regs and the regulations for 94-142, which is Education for All Handicapped Children Act, not the same thing. There wasn't, you know, people taking over buildings, but a different kind of protest was mounted. There were more letters sent to the Justice Department in protesting those two attempts than anything else, anything that the Justice Department was dealing with. Again, it was a kind of movement-building activity. At the same time, around 1980, the federal government started funding centers for independent living, which are basically, and there's at least one in every major city in this country now, about 200 of them around the country, which are basically a peer support idea, where you get people with disabilities who help other people with disabilities to get into the mainstream of life, to advocate for things that people with disabilities need. Those centers have provided focus points for advocacy since that time. And remember I mentioned ADAPT when I was talking about Denver? I think one of the most important movement-building activities of the 80s, if not the most important, has been carried on by a relatively small number of people who happen to be mobility impaired. That's not what's really important, who decided that they were tired of not being able to ride buses. So they have stopped buses in at least 25 cities in this country, been arrested, gone to jail, which has provided a lot of fun because a lot of police have had to figure out how the hell they're going to get them to jail and how they're going to get them in the inaccessible jails. And all kinds of good stuff like that. But what's interesting about that is that there are probably not more than 700 or 800 people who've been involved. But for every person who's been involved, there's 100 people out there with disabilities cheering them on. Just like with any kind of activist movement, most people don't want to get arrested. That doesn't mean that it doesn't raise their consciousness when one of theirs goes out and does it. That's been really important. The other important event, which all of you are aware of, was when the students took over Gallaudet University. That provided probably the best media coverage we've had, and provided awareness for a lot of people. The final kind of event that's brought people together is the Advocacy for the Americans with Disabilities Act. That has, by disability standards, been a major, major effort. When I say by disability standards, I'm saying that it still doesn't involve anywhere near the number of people who've been involved in the women's movement, black movement, Hispanics, but it's a hell of a lot of people for us. And as some of you know, there was a march in Washington last spring where 1,000 people marched on the Capitol. And a bunch of us crawled up the steps of the Capitol. Well, one advantage that we have is that if we get 1,000 people, it looks like 10,000 to most people, right? Because they see all those wheelchairs, and anything larger than 10 wheelchairs looks like a big crowd. So we have that media advantage. It is the thing, though, is that advocacy for ADA, because it's civil rights, which has brought people with disabilities together more than anything else that we've done. And I think the difference between us and other civil rights movements in terms of where we are now is that even though that's brought us together, we're still in a very formative stage. And what I think is going to happen is that the implementation of ADA is going to be what promotes the growth, the continued growth of the disability rights movement. There are going to be a lot of people around the country who are going to be educating people with disabilities as to their rights under ADA. And guess what's going to happen as a result of that? I hope. There are going to be a lot of people coming to EEOC who, for the first time, really believe that they have rights. And they are, for the first time, going to be brave enough to complain and to say, I was discriminated against, you know, rather than just accepting what's happening to them and thinking that it's part of what happens to somebody who's disabled. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with this in other contexts as well. This is not just a disability problem. It's a problem of people without power and people who do not believe that they are equal citizens. Poor people in general tend to believe that they are not equal citizens. They tend to be less willing to stand up and say, hey, you know, I'm a person too. This shouldn't be happening to me. And that's what we're dealing with people with disabilities. An awful lot of people, most of whom are poor, most of whom do not believe that they have rights even today. Most of whom, if they do believe that they have rights, have yet to be able to screw up the courage to say, I'm going to stand up for my rights. But I think that over the next 2 years, because there's going to be a lot of advocacy, we are going to see more and more people with disabilities who are willing to do that. And that's the point at which everybody in this room is going to become involved, because we're the people going to have to answer that new pride and the new willingness of people to stand up and say, I have rights too, and I'm going to pursue my legal rights. That's all I've got to say. Thanks.